Imagine the dry, scorching air of the Egyptian desert, filled not with silence, but with a deafening, monotonous grinding. It's the sound of thousands of hammers and bronze chisels furiously biting into granite and sandstone. We see thousands of hands, caked in stone dust, chipping away, erasing, destroying the same face, the same cartouche with a cursed name. This isn't happening in the heat of battle, but decades after the death of the one they are erasing. This is a cold, methodical, nationwide revenge. Priests in white robes walk among the workers, their voices like hissing snakes, chanting curses that condemn this man's soul to wander forever in darkness, to never reach the fields of Aru. They are not just destroying stone. They are committing a metaphysical murder, executing his soul in eternity. Their goal is damnatio memoriae, the curse of memory, the most terrible sentence the ancient world could deliver. They seek to ensure this man was not merely forgotten, but that he had never existed. This scene is the end of a drama, but for us, it will be the beginning. It immediately confronts us with the most burning question. Who was this Pharaoh, whose name was so toxic, whose life was so blasphemous, that the greatest civilization of antiquity spent colossal efforts to cut him out of their history like a cancerous tumor? What could a man, the anointed of the gods, have done to deserve a hatred that did not fade even after generations, and turned his image to dust and his reign into a void? This is not a story of being forgotten, but of being forcibly erased, a story of a battle for memory which the heretic Pharaoh lost. To understand the scale of his fall and the depth of this hatred, we must first see the summit from which he plunged. We travel back several decades to the era of his father, Amenhotep III, nicknamed the Magnificent. This is the golden age of the 18th dynasty, the zenith of the Egyptian empire's power and prosperity. The country is literally drowning in gold. Endless rivers of the precious metal flow from the southern mines of Nubia. From the Asian provinces, the Levant, Syria, Canaan, caravans bring tribute: cedar, lapis lazuli, silver, exotic animals, and thousands of slaves. The capital, the city of Thebes, is not just an administrative center. It is the navel of the world, a Babylon of its time. Its temple complexes, Karnak and Luxor, are so immense they seem built not by men, but by gods. But true power in this golden kingdom does not belong to the pharaoh alone. Next to the throne stands an invisible yet all-powerful rival, the priesthood of the chief state god, Amun-Ra. The temples of Amun are not mere houses of worship. They are a giant corporation, a state within a state. They own nearly a third of all cultivated land in Egypt. Their treasuries are bursting with gold. Their influence extends to all spheres of life, from appointing officials to launching military campaigns. The high priest of Amun is the second most important figure in the state, sometimes even challenging the authority of the pharaoh himself. The system seems as unshakable as the Great Pyramids. It is built on a 1,000-year tradition, on a complex pantheon of gods, where each has a role. Osiris rules the underworld. Isis protects mothers. Thoth grants wisdom. It is a complex, well-oiled machine, giving every Egyptian a sense of order and the hope of eternal life. It was into this world of absolute stability, gilded confidence, and hidden tension between the palace and the temple that a prince was born, destined to declare war on the very foundation of this civilization. Into this world of dazzling splendor and established traditions, an heir is born, Amenhotep, the future Akhenaten. From childhood, he seemed an otherworldly figure, a shadow against the backdrop of his radiant father, Amenhotep III. Ancient authors and modern researchers, analyzing his unusual portraits, suggest he may have suffered from genetic disorders, possibly Marfan syndrome, which would explain his strange, elongated physique. He grew up not as a warrior or a builder, but as a thinker, an introvert, who observed the lavish and perhaps hypocritical rituals in the temples of Karnak. He saw not so much the divine presence of Amun as his earthly servants, smug priests, drowning in luxury. He saw how the gold that should have strengthened the empire was settling in the bottomless temple treasuries. It is likely that his mother, the powerful Queen Taye, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and possibly non-royal origin, encouraged his critical thinking and independent judgment. While his peers from aristocratic families mastered the art of war and administration, the young prince may have immersed himself in the study of ancient theological texts from Heliopolis, the ancient center of worship for the sun god Ra. He saw how the cult of Amun, originally a local Theban god, had merged with the cult of Ra, creating the syncretic monster Amun-Ra, who usurped the power and glory of all other deities. A protest was brewing in his young mind, not just against the power of the priests, but against the very essence of this religion. Dark, cramped sanctuaries inaccessible to common mortals, secret rituals, and a complex, confusing pantheon where the true divine light was lost in the shadows of hundreds of minor gods. This was the alienation not of a politician, but of a prophet, who sensed the falsehood and was preparing to offer the world his own, and in his view, only truth. The idea that would seize the future pharaoh's mind did not appear out of thin air. It was lingering in the atmosphere among Egypt's intellectual elite. The sun cult was the most ancient in the land, and the god Ra of Heliopolis had long held the central place in the pantheon. However, the priests of Amun from Thebes managed a brilliant theological maneuver, merging their god with Ra to create the syncretic deity Amun-Ra, the king of gods. But even in the shadow of this colossus, more ancient and abstract solar beliefs persisted. One of them was connected to the Aten, the visible disk of the sun. This was not an anthropomorphic deity with the head of a falcon, like Ra, but the physical essence of the sun itself, its life-giving rays that grant warmth and life to all creation. This concept was far more universal. Amun-Ra was the god of Egypt, of its victories and its imperial ambitions. The Aten, however, shone for everyone, for Egyptians, Nubians, Syrians, Hittites. It was the god not of one nation, but of the entire world. Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, had already shown an interest in this cult, naming his ceremonial barge the splendor of Aten. It was an omen, a subtle hint of the changes to come. The young prince Amenhotep absorbed these ideas and took them to their logical, radical conclusion. If the Aten is the universal creator of all living things, then why are all the other gods necessary? Why the need for idols, temples, complex rituals, and most importantly, a caste of priestly intermediaries who claim they alone can speak with the divine? Akhenaten's idea was both simple and utterly revolutionary. There is one God, and he is directly accessible to everyone through his rays. This was not just a theological insight. It was a death sentence for the entire existing religious system, a harbinger of a storm that would shake the 1,000-year-old foundations. The future reformer's character was forged in unique circumstances. He was not just the heir to the throne. He was an intellectual, a philosopher, perhaps the first thinker of such scale in history to possess absolute power. His education was undoubtedly brilliant. He studied not only administration and military affairs, but also theology, literature, and art. But unlike his predecessors, he didn't just absorb knowledge, he reinterpreted it. A new worldview was forming in his mind, based on the principle of Ma'at, traditionally translated as order or justice, but for him, it became synonymous with truth. Truth, as he saw it, lay in rejecting the false, man-made images of gods, the secret rituals, and the complex myths. The truth was what you could see and feel, the light and warmth of the solar disk, the Aten. This obsession with truth bordered on fanaticism. He was a man of extremes, with no tolerance for compromise. If he believed in something, he believed in it absolutely and demanded the same of others. He combined the traits of a mystic visionary and a ruthless autocrat. He could write the Great Hymn to the Aten, one of the greatest poetic works of antiquity, full of love for a single creator god, and at the same time could coldly order the destruction of the names of other gods across the entire country. This duality made him so dangerous to the system. He was not an ordinary tyrant hungry for power for its own sake. He was a tyrant of an idea. He sincerely believed he was bringing the light of truth to his people, and he was prepared to impose that light by force, regardless of traditions, people's feelings, or the consequences for his empire. This crucible of character created not just a reformer, but a religious revolutionary, ready to burn the old world to the ground to build his new, sunlit Jerusalem on its ashes. Ascending to the throne after his father's death, the young Pharaoh, still bearing the name Amenhotep IV, did not hesitate. His first blow was struck at the very heart of the enemy, in Thebes, the citadel of the cult of Amun. On the east bank of the Nile, directly opposite the gigantic Karnak temple, he began construction of his own temple complex dedicated to the Aten. This act was an unheard-of audacity. He didn't just build another temple. He threw a direct challenge to the priests of Amun on their own sacred ground. The architecture of the new temple was as revolutionary as the faith itself. Instead of traditional dark, hypostyle halls with massive columns where the deity's statue hid in the gloom, the Temple of Aten was a series of open courtyards, flooded with sunlight. It had no roof, because the deity, the sun itself, was always visible and needed no man-made house. Instead of secret rituals for the initiated, there were public ceremonies under the open sky. It was an architectural slap in the face to 1,000 years of tradition. The priests of Amun, watching this construction from their pylons in Karnak, must have gnashed their teeth in fury. The pharaoh wasn't just ignoring them. He was demonstratively humiliating their god, showing that there was now a new, higher power in Egypt. He used the revenues that traditionally went to Amun's treasury to finance his own project. This was not just a religious reform. It was the beginning of an economic war, a redistribution of financial flows. And this was only the first step, a test of strength before the total revolution that would shake Egypt to its foundations. What drove this man? Was it a pure, untainted faith in a single, benevolent God, as some Egyptologists believe, seeing him as the first monotheist in human history? Or behind the facade of religious fervor, was there a cold and calculating politician whose true goal was to crush the immense power of the Theban priesthood? The answer most likely lies somewhere in between, in the complex psychology of this unique ruler. He undoubtedly possessed a deep religious feeling. The Great Hymn to the Aten, found in the tomb of one of his nobles, is striking in its sincerity and poetic power. It resonates with a genuine admiration for a universal creator God who cares for all peoples, not just the Egyptians. This was a theology thousands of years ahead of its time. However, the political aspect cannot be ignored. By the beginning of his reign, the power of the priests of Amun had become a real threat to the pharaoh's authority. They controlled vast wealth and lands, influenced state policy, and even the choice of an heir. Any far-sighted ruler would have sought a way to limit their influence. Akhenaten found the most radical way, not to limit, but to destroy, to rip out the very foundation of their power, the belief in the god Amun. By declaring the Aten the one true god, and himself as its sole son and prophet, he concentrated all religious and political power in his own hands. He became not just a king, he became a pope and an emperor in one person, the only bridge between humanity and God. This concentration of power was unprecedented. Thus, his inner fire was fueled by two sources. On one hand, the fire of mystical insight, a thirst for truth and spiritual renewal, and on the other, the icy flame of political ambition, a drive for absolute, unlimited power. It was this combination of fanatic and pragmatist that made his revolution so all-encompassing and ultimately so destructive. In the 5th year of his reign, the pharaoh takes a decisive step that transforms him from a reformer into a revolutionary. He publicly rejects the name given to him at birth, Amenhotep, which meant Amun is satisfied. This act is a public and ritualistic insult to the most powerful god in Egypt. In its place, he adopts a new name, Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, or he who is of service to the Aten. This is more than just a name change. It is a declaration of a new world paradigm. From now on, it is not Amun, the hidden god of the empire, who determines Egypt's destiny, but the Aten, the visible solar disk, the source of all life. His family changes their names along with him. His famous wife, Nefertiti, adds the epithet Neferuaten, beautiful are the perfections of the Aten, to her name. Their daughters receive names that also glorify the new god. It was a total rebranding of the ruling dynasty, a symbolic break with the entire past. Every time someone uttered the pharaoh's new name, they inadvertently praised the Aten and denied Amun. It was a brilliant and yet reckless move. He burned all his bridges, making any compromise with the old elite impossible. The priests of Amun and their numerous supporters across the country saw this as a declaration of war to the death. The pharaoh had not just changed his object of worship, he had declared their god to be false. From this moment on, the conflict ceased to be political or economic. It became existential. It was either the Aten and his prophet Akhenaten, or Amun and the entire 1,000-year-old order of Egyptian civilization. There was no middle ground. Akhenaten's next step was an act unprecedented in Egyptian history, moving the capital. He didn't just move to another city, he built a new capital from scratch, in the middle of nowhere, on a stretch of desert between Thebes and Memphis, which he claimed to have chosen on the direct instruction of the Aten itself. This place belonged to none of the old gods. It was clean land for a new beginning. The city was named Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten, modern-day Amarna. It was not just a city, it was a dream, a utopia made of stone. The city's plan was revolutionary. Wide, straight avenues oriented east to west to greet and bid farewell to the sun's journey each day. At its center stood a vast, open-air temple to the Aten, the pharaoh's palaces, and administrative buildings. Surrounding them were villas for nobles with gardens and pools, houses for artisans, and workers' quarters. The entire city was designed as a giant stage for the worship of light. Akhenaten ordered the entire royal court, all officials, aristocrats, scribes, architects, and generals, to abandon their luxurious estates in Thebes and Memphis and move to this unfinished city in the middle of the desert. This was a forced relocation of the elite, tearing them from their familiar environment, their comfort zone. For many, it was a personal tragedy. They lost connection to the tombs of their ancestors, to the temples where they had prayed their whole lives. But it was impossible to refuse the pharaoh. Akhetaten became the symbol of his break with the past. By leaving Thebes, he was leaving behind not just a city, he was leaving behind the darkness, the intrigue, and the power of the priests of Amun. He was departing for his new, sun-drenched world, naively believing the shadows of the past would not follow him. In his new city, Akhenaten creates and canonizes the main theological document of his era, the Great Hymn to the Aten. This work, carved on the wall of the tomb of the noble Eye, is one of the most astonishing texts to have survived from the ancient world, and it gives us the key to understanding the heretic pharaoh's worldview. The hymn is written in the first person, in Akhenaten's own voice, and is an ecstatic address to the one God. Its language is magnificent, and its ideas are revolutionary. In the hymn, the Aten is not just the god of Egypt, but the universal creator of all that exists. You create the Nile in the netherworld. You bring it forth as you desire to maintain the people. You have set a Nile in heaven, that it may descend for them. Their tongues are separate in speech, and their natures as well. Their skins are different, for you have distinguished the peoples. This is the first clearly articulated concept of universal monotheism in history, where God is the Father of all humanity, not just one chosen people. He is a God of life, light, and love. There is no hint of judgment, hell, or punishment in the hymn. However, hidden within this beautiful theological poem is a detail that turned it from a sermon into an instrument of absolute power. The hymn directly states, "There is none who knows you, save your son, Nefertiti, Akhenaten's throne name. You have made him wise in your plans and in your power." Thus Akhenaten proclaimed himself the sole intermediary between God and humanity. No one could appeal to the Aten directly. One could only pray to Akhenaten and his family, who in turn would relay those prayers to the Aten. This transformed him from a mere king into a living God and the one true prophet, making the entire old priestly hierarchy completely unnecessary and meaningless. Akhenaten's revolution was not only religious and political, but also aesthetic. One of the most shocking and recognizable manifestations of his era became what is known as Amarna art. The pharaoh broke with the 1,000-year-old artistic canon that demanded people, especially royalty, be depicted in an idealized, emotionless, and static manner. Instead, he demanded his artists follow the principle of ma'at, truth. But it was his own, very specific truth. On the reliefs and statues from Akhetaten, we see images that are startling, even repulsive in their strangeness. Akhenaten himself is depicted with an unnaturally elongated face and skull, spider-like limbs, wide feminine hips, and a drooping belly. His wife Nefertiti and their daughters are also given these grotesque features. Scholars still debate the reasons for this. Was it an attempt to realistically portray the effects of a genetic disorder that afflicted the royal family? Or was it a conscious artistic device, a symbolic depiction of the pharaoh as an androgynous being, both father and mother of all creation, like the creator god Aten? But the truth of Amarna art was not just in physical features. For the first time in the history of Egyptian art, we see intimate, emotional scenes from the royal family's life. Here is Akhenaten gently kissing his daughter. Here he grieves over the body of a deceased child. Here he and Nefertiti play with their 6 daughters under the life-giving rays of the Aten, which end in small hands, extending the Ankh symbol of life to them. These images were intended to show the pharaoh not as an unapproachable deity, but as a living human being, a loving father and husband who served as a model for his subjects. But for the conservative Egyptian society, such naturalism, bordering on caricature, was blasphemy and a debasement of the sacred image of the king. In this grand revolution, Akhenaten had a chief ally, a comrade in arms, and perhaps even a co-author, his wife, Queen Nefertiti. Her name, meaning "the beautiful one has come," has become synonymous with female beauty. But her role in history was far more significant than just that of a beautiful consort. During the Amarna period, she wielded power and influence unprecedented for an Egyptian queen. She was not merely a shadow of her husband, she was an active participant in all his endeavors. On the reliefs of the temples and palaces of Akhetaten, she is depicted almost as often as the pharaoh himself. She is present at all religious ceremonies, making offerings to the Aten, often alone, without her husband. Moreover, there are depictions of Nefertiti in poses traditionally reserved exclusively for the pharaoh, for instance in the scene of smiting enemies. This has led some Egyptologists to suggest that she was not just a queen, but an official co-regent with her husband, holding nearly equal authority. Their union was not just a family one, it was an ideological and political tandem. They conducted religious services together, appeared before the people together at the window of appearances in their palace. She was the high priestess of the new faith, the living embodiment of the feminine aspect of divine power. Perhaps it was her strong will and sharp mind that supported Akhenaten in his most radical decisions. Their public displays of affection, captured in art, were part of the new ideology of truth, but they might also have reflected the real depth of their feelings. However, the mysterious disappearance of this powerful woman from the historical stage in the later part of Akhenaten's reign remains one of the greatest enigmas of his era and perhaps signals a deep crisis that befell the revolution in its final years. While Akhenaten and Nefertiti were building their solar utopia in Akhetaten, dark clouds were gathering on the distant frontiers of their vast empire. Egypt during the 18th dynasty was a superpower, controlling extensive territories in Nubia and the Near East. These Asian possessions, which included Syria and Canaan, were a constant source of tribute and a buffer protecting Egypt from powerful neighbors, primarily the Hittite kingdom. Maintaining control over these lands required constant attention, diplomatic efforts, and, when necessary, military force. However, Akhenaten, completely absorbed in his religious reform, seems to have utterly neglected foreign policy. Unique evidence of this neglect is the Amarna archive, about 400 clay tablets found in the ruins of Akhetaten. This is the diplomatic correspondence between the pharaoh and his vassal rulers from Near Eastern city-states, like Byblos, Jerusalem, Megiddo, and with the kings of great powers, Babylonia, Assyria, Mitanni. The letters from the vassals are filled with desperation. They plead with the pharaoh to send troops to protect them from the raids of nomads known as the Habiru, and from the aggression of the rising Hittites. King Ribhada of Byblos writes dozens of tearful letters, reporting that his city is under siege and about to fall, but the response, it seems, was silence. Akhenaten, who preached of a universal God who cared for all peoples, in practice abandoned his allies to their fate. This had catastrophic consequences. Egypt began to lose its Asian provinces one by one. The empire's prestige and influence crumbled. The military elite, whose status and wealth depended on successful campaigns and tribute, watched with growing discontent as the pacifist Pharaoh squandered the legacy of his great warrior ancestors, like Thutmose III. This foreign policy failure was another nail in the coffin of his reign. Around the 9th year of his reign, Akhenaten crosses a final line, turning his reform into an open war against the past. Until this point, he had mainly promoted the cult of the Aten without resorting to mass repression against other gods. But now, having reached what he thought was the peak of his power, he commits an act that in the eyes of Egyptians was the greatest sacrilege. He issues a decree to destroy the names of the old gods throughout Egypt. The main target is his sworn enemy, Amun-Ra. Across the country, from the Nile Delta to the borders of Nubia, special teams of workers begin to chisel out the name Amun from temple pylons, tomb walls, statues, scarabs, and even personal belongings. Moreover, even the word gods in the plural is to be destroyed, as from now on there was only one god. This was a titanic undertaking, requiring immense resources. Imagine the psychological shock that ordinary Egyptians experienced when they saw royal officials desecrating the sacred names their ancestors had worshipped for 2,000 years. This was not just an ideological offensive, it was a direct assault on their identity, their culture, their connection to the world of their ancestors. Even his own father's name, Amenhotep III, was mutilated on many monuments because it contained the name of Amun. This moment of hubris, this act of total religious intolerance, became the point of no return. If Akhenaten previously had opponents, now he had millions of mortal enemies. He had declared war not just on the priests, he had declared war on the memory of his own people, and the people would eventually repay him in the same coin, by erasing his own memory. Despite the outward picture of the new faith's triumph, the paradise-like utopia in Akhetaten began to show cracks. The city, built in a hurry in the middle of the desert, was completely dependent on food supplies from the Nile Valley. Any disruption in this logistics could lead to famine. Furthermore, the dense population and possibly specific climatic conditions could have triggered epidemics. Some researchers link mentions of a plague in the region during this period specifically to Akhetaten. But the main crisis was spiritual. Akhenaten's religion was too abstract, too intellectual for the common people. It was centered on worshipping the pharaoh as the sole intermediary, but it offered no answers to the most pressing questions that concerned every Egyptian. What would happen to the soul after death? Who would protect them from evil spirits? Who would ensure the fertility of the fields and the birth of healthy children? The traditional pantheon provided answers to all these. Osiris was the king of the afterlife. Taweret was the patroness of childbirth. Bes chased away evil spirits. Akhenaten took away these familiar and understandable protectors from the people, offering nothing in return but a distant and abstract solar disk. In private homes in Akhetaten, archaeologists find small statuettes of the old gods that residents hid from the authorities. This is silent testimony that the revolution failed to capture the hearts of the people. They might publicly worship the Aten out of fear or for career reasons, but in their hearts, they remained loyal to the old gods. The discontent was growing. The utopia built on coercion turned out to be a colossus with feet of clay, ready to collapse at the first serious shock. The culmination of Akhenaten's religious fanaticism, and likely his fatal mistake, was the decree to close all temples of the old gods throughout the country. This was no longer just an act of vandalism against names. It was a total blow to the entire socio-economic structure of Egypt. We must understand that ancient Egyptian temples were not just places of prayer. They were giant economic complexes, comparable to modern corporations or banks. They owned vast tracts of land, which they leased to peasants. They had their own herds, workshops, and fleets, and controlled a significant portion of foreign trade. The temples provided jobs for hundreds of thousands of people: priests, scribes, artisans, farmers, builders, bakers, and brewers. Closing the temples meant the instantaneous shutdown of this gigantic economic machine. This led to mass unemployment, economic chaos, and the impoverishment of the population. Furthermore, the temples performed crucial social functions. They were centers of education, archives, hospitals, and places for food distribution during famines. By destroying this system, Akhenaten created nothing to replace it. The entire country's economy was now tied to his new capital and the will of one man. This step finally turned not only the priesthood against him, but also the vast masses of common people, who lost not only their gods, but also their livelihoods. The fury and desperation sown by this fatal act became the soil in which the future restoration and total revenge against the heretic Pharaoh would grow. Towards the end of his reign, Akhenaten seems to have sunk deeper into isolation and personal tragedy. His sunlit paradise was overshadowed by the specter of death. Of the 6 daughters we see in the joyous family scenes of the Amarna period, at least one, Akhetaten, died in her youth. The scene of her parents' mourning is one of the most poignant works of Amarna art. It's possible that other daughters also died from an epidemic that struck the city. But the greatest mystery of this period is the disappearance from the historical stage of his main pillar of support, Queen Nefertiti. Around the 12th to 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, her name ceases to be mentioned in official inscriptions. What happened to her? There are many different theories. Perhaps she died, a victim of the same plague. Perhaps she fell out of favor and was exiled to one of her palaces in the north of Akhetaten. Some researchers propose a more intriguing theory. She didn't disappear, but on the contrary, her power grew so much that she became an official co-regent of her husband under the male throne name Smenkhkare. Whatever the case, the loss of his wife and daughters, as well as the growing resistance to his reforms, must have been a devastating blow to the pharaoh. He, who had proclaimed his god the source of life, was powerless in the face of death in his own family. Perhaps this only strengthened his fanaticism, making him cling ever more fiercely to his faith. But at the same time, he was becoming an increasingly lonely prophet, surrounded by hostility, misunderstanding, and the shadows of his deceased loved ones in his emptying capital. The final years of Akhenaten's reign are shrouded in mystery and marked by the appearance on the historical stage of an enigmatic figure named Smenkhkare. He appears in inscriptions as Akhenaten's co-regent, but his identity is still a subject of fierce debate among Egyptologists. Who was he? Some believe he was Akhenaten's younger brother or his son by a minor wife. Others see him as the pharaoh's lover, which some ambiguous depictions might suggest. But the most popular and romantic version holds that Smenkhkare was Nefertiti herself, who after her female persona disappeared, adopted a male throne name to rule alongside her husband, or even to succeed him, much like the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. Smenkhare's reign was very short, perhaps only a year or two, but in that brief time it seems the first steps toward a compromise with the old priesthood were taken. Smenkhare's name is sometimes accompanied by an epithet that can be translated as beloved of Amun, a clear departure from the strict doctrine of Atenism. Perhaps seeing the empire sliding into the abyss, Akhenaten himself or his inner circle decided to make concessions and open a dialogue with Thebes. However, this attempt at reconciliation, if it ever happened, came too late and was unsuccessful. Smenkhkare soon dies or disappears as mysteriously as he appeared. His short and phantom-like reign was merely a brief prelude to the complete collapse of the Amarna revolution, the death throes of a regime that was already doomed. While Akhenaten was absorbed in his religious and family problems in the isolated city of Akhetaten, a powerful conspiracy of silence was forming behind his back. The key figures in it were the men who formed the backbone of Egyptian power, high-ranking military officials and influential courtiers. Two figures stood out, destined to play a decisive role in Egypt's future. The first was General Horemheb, the commander-in-chief of the army. As a professional soldier, he watched in horror as the pacifist Pharaoh allowed the Asian empire, built with the blood and sweat of his predecessors, to fall apart. He was a man of action, not theology, and he despised the religious experiments that were undermining the state's power. The second figure was the God's father, a wise and cunning courtier who had held high posts even under Akhenaten's father. He may have been Queen Taya's brother, and therefore the pharaoh's uncle. He publicly supported the reforms and built himself a lavish tomb in Akhetaten, adorned with hymns to the Aten. But in his heart, he likely remained a follower of the old traditions. These men, along with many other military leaders, officials, and priests who were forced to move to Akhetaten, formed a shadow government. They did not openly oppose the all-powerful pharaoh, but they were waiting. They wove webs of intrigue, formed alliances, and prepared for the moment the heretic would die. Their goal was not just to seize power, but to restore Ma'at, the traditional order that Akhenaten had so recklessly destroyed. It was the calm before the storm, a silent wait for the prophet's death, so they could then furiously descend upon his legacy. The final years of Akhenaten's reign in Akhetaten were likely a time of oppressive fear, decline, and disillusionment. The city that was conceived as the eternal horizon of the Aten, a symbol of light and truth, was visibly turning into its opposite. The revolutionary enthusiasm of the early years gave way to fatigue and apathy. The elite, forcibly driven into the desert, yearned for their ancestral estates in Thebes and Memphis. The common people, suffering from economic hardship and cut off from their gods, grumbled ever more loudly. Epidemics and high mortality, including within the royal family, could have been seen as the gods' punishment for the pharaoh's apostasy. Akhetaten was increasingly becoming a gilded cage, isolated from the rest of the country, which was living its own clandestine life, secretly worshipping the old gods. Akhenaten himself, having lost his wife, daughters, and perhaps faith in the support of his divine father, became ever more rigid and uncompromising. He may have seen conspiracies in every corner, feeling the growing hatred that surrounded him. The palaces and temples, built with such speed and enthusiasm, may have already begun to decay. The once shining utopia was turning into a ghost town, inhabited by frightened people who were just waiting for the end. The inexorable movement towards the finale was obvious to everyone, except perhaps the pharaoh himself, blinded by the light of his own sun. His revolution, which began as a hymn to life, was ending in an atmosphere of death and despair. In the 17th year of his reign, at around the age of 40, Pharaoh Akhenaten dies. The circumstances of his death are shrouded in mystery, which only adds to the drama of his story. There are no records describing his passing. Did he die of an illness? Perhaps the same epidemic that claimed the lives of his family members. Or was he poisoned by his enemies, who were tired of waiting for his natural death? Was it a palace coup organized by Horemheb and I? We will never know for sure. He was buried in a rock tomb prepared for him in the mountains east of Akhetaten, but his body did not remain there. It was likely later moved and reburied, and then perhaps destroyed by his enemies. The enigmatic mummy from tomb KV55 in the Valley of the Kings, which some researchers identify as Akhenaten, bears traces of a hasty and careless reburial. He died in his lonely city, and his death was likely met in the rest of Egypt not with grief, but with relief. He left behind a country in a state of deep ideological and economic crisis. His great experiment had failed. He tried to force a new faith upon his people, but faith cannot be imposed by force. It must grow from within. The sun of Aten continued to shine over Egypt, but for the people it once again became just one of the faces of the god Ra, not the sole deity. The revolution was dead, and the vultures of the old order were already preparing to feast on its corpse. Immediately after Akhenaten's death, his only surviving male heir ascended the throne. A 9-year-old boy named Tutankhamun, meaning living image of the Aten. He was likely Akhenaten's son by a minor wife, perhaps the mysterious Kia. The child pharaoh became the perfect instrument in the hands of the powerful courtiers who had waited so long for their moment. Real power fell into the hands of the vizier I and the commander-in-chief Horemheb. These two experienced and ruthless politicians immediately began the process of counter-reformation. Their first and primary task was to reconcile with the powerful Theban priesthood of Amun and restore the old order. The young Tutankhamun, raised in Akhetaten and in his father's faith, could not stop them. He was merely a pawn in their great game. They understood that to save Egypt from chaos and restore its former glory, it was necessary to completely dismantle the heretic's legacy. And they had to start at the very top, with the name of the ruling pharaoh. The boy on the throne was a symbol of Atenism, and that symbol had to be destroyed to make way for the triumphant return of the old gods. His short reign became a turning point, a time when the pendulum of history swung back with terrifying force. The Great Betrayal, as Akhenaten's followers might have called it, was not long in coming. In the 2nd or 3rd year of the young pharaoh's reign, under pressure from his regents, I and Horemheb, he performs the decisive symbolic act that puts an end to his father's entire revolution. He publicly renounces his faith in the Aten. His name, Tutankhaten, is changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. His wife, Akhenaten's daughter, Ankhesenpaten, also changes her name to Ankhesenamun. This act was a signal to the entire country. The heresy is over. The old gods are back. Shortly thereafter, a decree known as the Restoration Stela was issued. In this text, written in Tutankhamun's name, Akhenaten's reign is described as a time of chaos and ruin. The temples of the gods and goddesses had fallen into decay. The land was in turmoil, and the gods had turned their backs on it. The decree proclaimed the restoration of all temples, the resumption of sacrifices, and the return of all privileges and wealth to the priests. The culmination of this process was the triumphant move of the royal court from the cursed Akhetaten back to Thebes. The return to the ancient capital was not just an administrative decision, it was a grand religious and political spectacle. It symbolized the victory of Amun over the Aten, the victory of tradition over revolution, the victory of the priests over the heretic pharaoh. For Akhenaten, this was a posthumous and most terrible defeat. His own son, his own flesh and blood, had become the instrument for destroying everything he had dedicated his life to. With the departure of the royal court, the fate of Akhetaten was sealed. The city that was built as an eternal monument to a new faith was abandoned as quickly as it was built. Tens of thousands of its inhabitants, officials, artisans, soldiers, packed their belongings and followed Tutankhamun's court to Thebes and Memphis. Akhetaten became deserted. Its wide avenues, once filled with people, fell silent. The desert winds buried the luxurious villas and palaces in sand. The city of the sun became a ghost town. But mere oblivion was not enough for its enemies. For them, Akhetaten was not just an abandoned capital. It was a symbol of heresy, the material embodiment of Akhenaten's sin. A few years later, during the reign of Horemheb and the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, its systematic destruction began. The city was turned into a quarry. Its temples, palaces, and public buildings were dismantled block by block. The stone from the cursed city was used to build new pylons and halls in the temple of Amun at Karnak, a symbol of the old god's final triumph. It was an act of ritual humiliation. What was built to the glory of the Aten now served to magnify its enemy. Akhetaten was cursed and consigned to oblivion for 3,000 years, until 19th-century archaeologists stumbled upon its ruins, revealing to the world a lost chapter in Egypt's history. The fall of the City of the Sun was the final act in the drama of destroying Akhenaten's legacy, the physical erasure of his dream from the face of the earth. After the death of the young Tutankhamun and the short reign of the elderly Ai, the throne was seized by the one who had waited the longest for his hour, the commander-in-chief, Horemheb. He was not related by blood to the ruling dynasty. He was a self-made man, and he was determined to restore order and might to Egypt at any cost. It was under him that the restoration of the old ways turned into a total and merciless revenge. The priests of Amun-Ra, having regained their full power and wealth, demanded not just that the heretic be forgotten, but that he be completely and eternally cursed. They could not forgive Akhenaten, not only for their economic losses, but also for the mortal insult dealt to their god. Their power, after the humiliation they had endured, became even more absolute and intolerant. They got everything they wanted, and more. The wealth confiscated by Akhenaten was returned to them with interest. Their political influence reached unprecedented heights, but that was not enough. To ensure such heresy would never happen again, a terrifying precedent had to be set. The memory of Akhenaten had to be not just erased, but turned into a warning for future generations. Amun's triumph had to be absolute, and it demanded the complete and final destruction of his enemy, both in this world and the next. The most extensive campaign for the damnation of memory in Egyptian history began. Under Horemheb and his successors from the 19th dynasty, Seti I, Ramesses II, the destruction of Akhenaten's memory was elevated to state policy. This process, which historians call by the Latin term damnatio memoriae, was not just an act of political vandalism in Egypt, but a deeply meaningful religious act. The Egyptians believed that for the soul to exist in the afterlife, the name and image of the deceased had to be preserved in the world of the living. A name was not just a set of sounds, but a part of a person's essence. To destroy the name was to kill the soul in eternity, to condemn it to final and complete non-existence. This was the terrible sentence passed on Akhenaten, his family, and his closest followers. Special crews were sent throughout the country to methodically chisel his name and face from all surviving monuments. His statues were smashed into thousands of pieces and buried. His tomb in Akhetaten was desecrated, and his mummy was most likely destroyed. In official documents and on temple walls, he was referred to not by name, but by derogatory epithets such as that criminal of Akhetaten, or simply the enemy. This was an attempt to create a black hole in history, a vacuum in the place of his 17-year reign. The goal was simple and horrifying: to make sure that no one would ever again speak his name or see his face, thereby guaranteeing that his cursed soul would vanish forever. Parallel to the physical destruction of monuments was the process of rewriting history. Egyptian scribes working in temple scriptoriums were ordered to erase the Amarna period from official king lists. These lists, such as the famous Abydos king list created under Seti I, were crucial documents that legitimized the power of the ruling dynasty and presented history as an unbroken chain of lawful rulers. In these new, edited versions of history, Horemheb immediately followed Amenhotep III. The 17 years of Akhenaten's reign, as well as the short reigns of Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and I, were simply cut out, as if they had never happened. The total length of their reigns was simply added to the years of Horemheb's rule to hide the chronological gap. Thus, for subsequent generations of Egyptians, Akhenaten and his successors officially ceased to exist. They became the pharaohs who were not. This historical falsification proved to be incredibly successful. For nearly 3,000 years, the world knew nothing of Akhenaten. His name appeared neither in the works of Greek historians like Herodotus, nor in the writings of the Egyptian priest Manetho. He completely disappeared, dissolved in time, becoming only a vague hint of a heretic king in later, distorted legends. The priests of Amun and the restorer pharaohs had achieved their goal. They did not just kill a man, they killed the very memory of him. The irony of history is that the totality of the destruction ultimately led to a resurrection. Precisely because Akhetaten was so quickly abandoned and cursed, it was not built over by later cities, like Thebes or Memphis. Its ruins were buried under the desert sands and preserved in a unique state, like a time capsule. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists, first Flinders Petrie, then Ludwig Borchardt, began excavating the site known today as Tel el Amarna. What they discovered shook the world. A whole city rose from oblivion, with its temples, palaces, and residential quarters. Thousands of artifacts were found: the famous Amarna archive, and of course, the works of the unique Amarna art. The crown jewel of these finds was the world-famous bust of Nefertiti, discovered in 1912 in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose. The heretic Pharaoh, whom they had tried so hard to erase from history, rose from the ashes. The world began to speak of him as a hero, a tragic figure ahead of his time. He was called the first individual in history, the first prophet of monotheism, a forerunner of Moses and Christ. Sigmund Freud dedicated his last work, Moses and Monotheism, to him. The forgotten and cursed Pharaoh became one of the most discussed and romanticized figures of ancient history. His legacy, preserved in the sand, proved more durable than the granite from which his name was chiseled. The curse cast by his enemies ultimately failed. Now we can return to the main question posed at the very beginning. Why? Why was the hatred for this pharaoh so absolute that it required not just his forgetting, but his total metaphysical annihilation? The answer is multi-layered. It wasn't just the priest's revenge for lost wealth and power, although that played a huge role. Akhenaten did something far more terrible in the eyes of Egyptian civilization. First, he attacked its economic foundation. By destroying the temple system, he caused an economic collapse that affected all levels of society. Second, he attacked its social and cultural foundation. He took away the people's familiar gods, rituals, festivals, and amulets that for millennia had provided them with psychological comfort and a sense of stability. But most importantly, and this was his mortal sin, he attacked the metaphysical foundation of the Egyptian worldview. His religion of the Aten, with its focus on life here and now under the sun's rays, was incompatible with the central idea of all Egyptian civilization, the idea of eternal life after death. The traditional funerary cult, associated with Osiris, the judgment in the afterlife, mummification, and complex burial rituals, was the meaning of existence for every Egyptian, from the pharaoh to the simple peasant. Akhenaten essentially abolished this cult, offering no clear alternative. In doing so, he stole his people's hope for immortality. This was a crime that could not be forgiven. He attacked not power or money. He attacked eternity. And in response, a civilization obsessed with eternity sentenced him to non-existence. This is the solution to the paradox. The all-powerful ruler was turned into nothing because he tried to take everything away from his people. So who was he? This pharaoh who unleashed a storm that nearly sank the stone ship of Egyptian civilization. A visionary, 3,000 years ahead of his time. The first prophet of a single God who preached love and truth. Or was he a dangerous fanatic, a narcissistic tyrant who, for the sake of his abstract idea, plunged a prosperous empire into chaos, abandoned his allies, and condemned his people to suffering? There is no, and never will be, a single answer to this question. Akhenaten is an eternal mirror in which every generation sees a reflection of its own debates about religion, power, tradition, and revolution. His story is an epic tale of the tragedy of a man who thought himself equal to a god and tried to remake the world in his own image. He showed how easily the pursuit of absolute truth can turn into absolute tyranny. His fate is a grim warning that even the most powerful ruler, possessing seemingly limitless power, is helpless against traditions rooted in the hearts of millions. He wanted to give his people light, but he did it so clumsily and cruelly that in response he received only the darkness of a curse. And in this lies the main, universal lesson of his story. A revolution that disregards human nature and despises the past is doomed to be devoured by its own children and erased from the pages of history, only to rise from the sand thousands of years later, no longer as a truth, but as an eternal, unresolvable question.